Conservative Party in Scotland, giving a really, passionate speech about obviously her individual identifying as a gay woman, and yet most of her party voted against it. So how does that sit with her, relationship with them as her party and her as their leader? And what does that say about their respect for her choices? I found that an interesting thing to look at. And also, further interestingly, Annabel Goldie and John Lamont, who are the Scottish Conservatives, actually voted for the bill, and both referenced the fact that they're Church of Scotland lay readers. So I think there's definitely something going on in the church, and there's elements of it that are much more progressive. But as I say, my worry is there's still this real bigotry that has been slightly exposed by this debate in the Parliament last week. We shall see how that develops.
But I think, given how strongly they voted for the first phase, I don't think there's any doubt that it will be passed.
Oh, no. I mean in a more sort of insidious sense that even when equal rights are supposedly enshrined in legislation or in society, it doesn't necessarily mean that you evade the misogyny or bigotry or homophobia that can still exist under the surface.
This brings us back to the constitution question that we were talking about last week. Should these equal rights be enshrined in our constitution? But couldn't they all just be encapsulated in one line, don't be an arsehole?
That's like I want to set up, my friend Claire and I want to set up an organisation called Shut the Fuck Up If You Don't Know What You're Talking About.
There's an interesting point about how the opposition was framed as well. There were 15 MSPs voted against the proposals and 5 abstained. A couple of the Labour, the McMahon family, the father and daughter abstained. I don't know quite why, but I think it might be something to do with religious feeling. But it was interesting. There was a couple of groups, I suppose you could say. There was the religious group, the group like Rosanna Cunningham, who essentially said, as a committed Catholic herself, marriage is a sacrament. I'm going to follow my conscience, in inverted commas, and vote against because marriage is something written in the natural law, the mind of God, or whatever her belief is. And then you had the kind of odd John Mason argument, which I touched on in a wee blog this week, which was essentially that the safeguards for religious freedom were not sufficiently robust. Therefore, he was going to vote no, but he sort of implied that you would have voted yes if he thought it had been sufficiently robust. And I think that takes us back to the certainty question again. If you have a constitution, no matter what it says, that's going to introduce legal uncertainty into the process. If you have fundamental rights that people can use to challenge legislation, as an independent Scotland probably would, as devolution has given us in the Scottish Parliament, you can rely on the ECHR. There's never going to be certainty like that. There's never going to be certainty about a knockdown certainty about the legality of a measure. Take one very good example. I'm told by the guy that's bringing it that there's going to be a judicial review shortly of the franchise of the independence referendum on the basis that it doesn't give votes to prisoners. So that's going to go before a court in Scotland. He's not going to win, but it's going to go before a court and it's going to be tested. And I think there's a question here about the exaggerated fears, the legal uncertainty being used as a resource by people who really are trying to find a good reason to vote against a bill and trying not to say that it's because of their religious convictions, because there is a sense, I think, that that's not really the role of faith in the public sphere, to quote old Ratzinger, is a problematic one in a contemporary democracy. And I think we'll see that again with Margot MacDonald's bill on assisted suicide legislation, which she's proposing in draft, which has now been published and which will be considered again in Holyrood this term. I think we'll come back to these themes of religious freedom, morality, and the ability of individuals to take choices affecting their own life. So it's going to be an insistent theme, I think, in the 4th session of the Scottish Parliament.
I was thinking about this quite a lot today, because I was thinking, what is it? Because yes, religious freedom was hard fought for. Some people died for their religion in the past, but it's almost like, well, they have that privilege now. We do have freedom of religion. We do have freedom to practice different religions. So what kind of tension is there that then you are preventing other people from exercising their rights to choose different ways of pursuing their lives? So I don't know, it's fascinating.
Ivan?
Going back to something that Andrew commented on, I think it's probably fair to say that I'm the only person on the discussion today that remembers the 70s. Would that be fair to say? So I've got a probably slightly longer historical perspective in terms of what I've seen through my own experience. And it's absolutely true to say that the difference between attitudes in the 70s and early 80s compared to attitudes of my children growing up now, who are teenagers and early 20s now, is it's unbelievable, like, absolutely unbelievable. And the point Andrew makes about how that social kind of transformation happened. Now, there was a lot of people campaigning for stuff, obviously, at one level, but I think you're right to say the real change has just been something slowly, quietly working away in the background. And people growing up having friends who were gay and that just being accepted as normal. It just kind of happened over the last couple of decades, and it's been quite dramatic. And an interesting comment, I mean, while it's something completely different, to my mind, that's about normalisation. And normalisation, I think, is something round about the independence debate, to come back to that briefly. And it's about a concept going from being something that was kind of weird on the fringes to something that's been mainstream. And I think a big part of the campaign at the moment is all about people coming to the realisation that this is something that could happen, and how does the world look like after it. And I think at this phase in the campaign, it's all about normalisation. So it's interesting, how does that social change take place? Is it just individuals talking to people, which is the essence of the Yes kind of ground campaign, or is there some other factors in there that drive it?
That's, I think, a really interesting and an important parallel. I think you're right, and it maybe suggests something which one of my unionist pals was saying recently, that he thinks that No can win this time round, but probably would struggle to win next time round. So I think even though it would be very downheartening if on the sort of the autumn of next year that we weren't in a triumphant position on the Yes campaign, on the other hand, there is a generational transformation that's gone on. Down at the Radical Independence Conference yesterday, unfortunately I couldn't make it, but afterwards they're having their national collective sort of meet up, they're having a kind of big party. All of these people who are smart, articulate, educated people who will play a significant role in the civic life of this nation all know one another now, wouldn't have known one another before. All of these kind of relationships all have worked together. That is something which actually, maybe to lift Juliet's spirits, is something which is a real resource and a real radical transformation and an energisation of a whole part of the country, not the whole country, but a part of the country, which will be there whether or not we get a yes or no vote. And I think that's an important point too about this normalisation. It stimulates people towards political activity, and hopefully it might create a more active citizenship as a consequence.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I'm kind of struggling with Juliet's position a wee bit to try and get my head around it, because to some extent this vote is a winner takes all. If it's a yes vote, then as far as Scotland's concerned, Westminster's history, the people that you talked about, Andrew, the RIC this weekend, and many others, and I work in the business environment, and there's all kinds of people getting involved in discussion about nation building. What does the country look like after? How do we make it happen? So all that power for change is all lined up, ready to move forward with that discussion and that change. If on the other hand it's a no vote, then there isn't going to be any more powers. Westminster will pull the drawbridge up. The Scottish Government, to a large extent, will become neutered. Barnett will go. The funding will be cut. And whatever kind of discussions you're having in that environment post-no are going to be fairly irrelevant, because whatever you want to do, you'll not be in any position to execute any of it.
It's a very interesting discussion. Just to finish up on that, with the religious thing, you mentioned Ratzinger. I was brought up a Catholic. Juliet said she was brought up in the church. This is my question. What on earth does Joseph Ratzinger fill his days with these days? I don't quite get it. And with these popes, what a difference between the two. Really, it's amazing. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in that anymore, but did you see the brilliant thing that came out this week? Sarah Palin, who said she thinks this pope is too left-wing. And immediately someone tweeted, well, wait till she hears about this guy called Jesus. Which I thought was excellent. But
that's marvelous.
Okay,
what an interesting character, the current Pope, no question. Even some of my hardened atheistical friends, or anti-theist friends, if you like, are rather warming to him. I think largely because there's a sense that there's a critique of rampant markets and money and the devaluation of people here, which is something which actually many people on the left could get behind, albeit for rather different reasons than maybe Pope Francis would give for his passion in that direction.
Again, for me, it comes back to privilege and historical discrimination, because he's from the global south. He understands that so much more than someone who's from one of the wealthier Western nations.
Well, speaking of wealthier Western nations, Juliet, I believe you were down in London recently. So given that, I've spent time in London and it's quite the done thing to stereotype Scots a lot, so I think I'll just return the favour. Were you eating lots of jelly deals and meeting pearly kings, and were you going to pubs called the Dog and Duck and, I don't know, the Walrus and Muppet, whatever they want? So, what were they saying in London about the independence debate? What did you notice?
The most interesting thing is how people's views have softened, or people I know anyway, obviously is a sort of largely liberal section of the population in the true sense of the word. So, people are less just, oh no, you can't possibly go, and more sort of interested in considering how the debate is going and, what we might look forward to in the future. And I think that's because of the negative impacts of the coalition government, and that everybody's searching for some kind of glimmer of hope or light at the end of the tunnel. What was interesting was I actually went to a busman's holiday, if you will, went to the House of Commons and sat in on DEFRA questions, and just sitting there and watching, even though it wasn't Prime Minister's questions, it was still that obviously confrontational, either side of the benches, and just people lying to each other about things. Someone would ask the Minister a question and he'd give an answer and I'd be like, but that's not true. And if I know it's not true, surely you know it's not true. So why does nobody get to challenge you on that? I don't understand. So I think there was something about that inherent business of politics and how politics is broken. And so, if independence can fix that, then that would be awesome. But I'm just not 100% certain that it could.
I think Ivan might have an interesting take on this, because with your work, you're probably making deals with companies south of the border. Are they asking you anything about it? Is there, the standard thing, is there uncertainty? But what kind of conversations have you had with people?
I think that there's two parts to that. In terms of the business side of it, it's completely and utterly irrelevant. I mean, at the end of the day, businesses will deal with businesses where they are, depending on whether it makes business sense. So the constitutional issue in that sense, that there's absolutely no concept of it throwing up barriers that are going to make it difficult for people to do business. So that whole scare story you can bin straight away. More interesting is having conversations with people on a personal level, and I think there has been a shift. I mean, I spend quite a bit of time in Manchester, Newcastle, other parts of down south, and I think 6-12 months ago, people would have to a large extent laughed, or been a bit kind of dismissive, I would say, a bit kind of dismissive of the whole concept of Scottish independence. Now you're getting much more of a, that's interesting, tell me more. What would it look like? What are the issues? Which is taken much more seriously, I would say, than it was even, say, 6 months ago.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Can you give us an example of an argument you got into, Juliet? I'm interested in this. Let's get a bit of spice into the podcast.
I suppose I'm actually going to have to let you down there, because so basically about a year ago when I was down and I was visiting with my cousin and her husband, and he works in the financial sector, so he was all about, economically it can't happen, it's just impossible. I've seen the figures, all the rest of it. As I mentioned before, when people start talking about numbers, I tend to switch off, so I may not have paid proper attention. But this time around, he was just asking questions about, what do people seem to be thinking? How might vote go? And I think that sort of element of curiosity more than dismissal is, as Ivan said, definitely developing. Having said that, and as I mentioned earlier, in my work, there's definitely a focus towards the 2015 general election and almost ignoring the fact that we're having a referendum between now and then. So there's a real sort of tension, I think, between what ordinary punters in London think about what's going on up here and what political hacks think about what's going on up here.
Andrew, I'll add a bit of topspin to this topic first, because there's been a couple of reports in the last couple of weeks suggesting that if they lose, the No campaign may, or the British government may try to hold then a UK-wide referendum. Although this could be an explosive situation, but there has been those suggestions. So how important do you think it the public opinion on this story in England is. We've asked you before about your time in Oxford, and you've talked about this, but how important do you think to the debate in Scotland is public opinion in England?
Not wildly, I would say. I think my experience echoes what Ivan and Juliet said, just to touch on it briefly, that there was curiosity primarily, and frequently a fairly dismissive account as well. I've written about that before. I think that there is a problem with the sort of London bubble media, and it's a problem which is just a feature of the UK politics as such, fixated on Westminster, fixated on the kind of court